Title: Inside California's Most Dangerous Prison, where humanity is tested every day. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. The gates of Pelican Bay. At the far northern edge of California, near the fog-covered coast and dense redwood forests, stands a prison built for men the state could no longer control. Locals call it the Bay, but to those who've served time inside, its full name, Pelican Bay State Prison, carries a different weight. From the sky, the facility looks orderly, pale gray blocks shaped like an X, razor wire fences stretching across acres of pine and mud. But on the ground, everything feels heavier. The air is colder. The silence is thicker. Even the gulls that hover above seem to move cautiously, circling the same concrete square where time itself appears trapped. Pelican Bay was opened in 1989, at the height of California's gang wars. Officials needed a place strong enough to contain the leaders who were running street operations from inside other prisons. What they created was a supermax facility, a place where control was absolute and freedom ended at the cell door. Each morning begins the same. Steel gates roll open, the sound echoing through the corridors like thunder. Guards in gray uniforms walk in formation, checking doors, speaking little. Every movement is scripted. Every noise carries authority. Behind those doors are men whose crimes once made headlines, hardened gang figures, lifers, and those who turned violence into power. The Security Housing Unit, known as the SHU, is where the system isolates those it deems too dangerous for the general population. Cells measure roughly 8 by 10 feet. There are no bars, only solid steel doors with narrow slots for food trays. A small window near the ceiling allows a thin line of daylight, enough to remind inmates the sun still exists but never enough to touch it. Inside, life unfolds in fragments. Breakfast arrives at 6 a.m., slid through the slot by a gloved hand. Inmates eat in silence, often seated on concrete beds. Some read old magazines. Some write letters they'll never send. Others pace the limited space, counting steps to hold onto a sense of motion. For one inmate, let's call him Luis, this routine became both punishment and salvation. Before Pelican Bay, Luis ran with a Los Angeles gang. He entered the system at 22, angry, impulsive, certain that strength meant domination. By the time he reached the SHU, most of his friends were dead or serving life. He'd never imagined the kind of loneliness waiting behind these walls. "The first week I thought I was tough," he said later in an interview. "By the second week, I realized silence is stronger than any man." Psychologists who study Pelican Bay describe the facility as a living experiment in human endurance. Inmates spend 22 to 23 hours a day alone. Exercise happens in small, enclosed yards sometimes called dog runs. Concrete boxes with open ceilings where men see a patch of sky but never another person. Over months and years, the mind begins to shift. Some prisoners meditate or study to stay sane. Others talk through vents just to prove their voices still work. The institution calls it discipline. Critics call it sensory deprivation. For most, it's survival. What separates Pelican Bay from other prisons isn't just its design, it's the emotional gravity. Guards and inmates live under the same constant tension. Officers know a single mistake could spark violence. Prisoners know a single rule violation could add years in isolation. Everyone follows invisible rules that maintain balance in a place built on chaos. But amid that pressure, rare moments of change happen. A few inmates choose education programs offered through mailed lessons. Some take up art, sketching the trees they haven't seen in decades. Luis began writing poems about freedom, not freedom from walls but from anger. "You start realizing," he said, "real power is staying calm when everything wants to break you." Outside, most people never think about Pelican Bay until a headline appears. Yet inside, thousands of lives continue in slow motion. Men confronting their past mistakes and learning that redemption, if it exists, starts with acceptance. As the day ends, lights dim to a dull blue glow. The air vents hum. Somewhere, a guard checks the corridor and notes, "All secure." For the world beyond those gates, another evening begins. But for the men of Pelican Bay, every night is the same test. Can the human spirit survive total control? The mind in isolation. If concrete could think, it might remember every sound it has ever heard. Inside Pelican Bay State Prison's Security Housing Unit, the walls hold stories that few will ever tell. Every scrape of a tray, every muffled shout, every sigh becomes part of the building's memory. For the men living inside, that same silence starts to live inside them too. By the second year of isolation, time no longer feels like days, it feels like echoes. Guards still make their rounds, doors still clang, lights still flicker, but inside the cells, life has slowed to the rhythm of breathing. Some inmates count steps. Some recite prayers. Some stare at the ceiling until shapes form out of shadows. Survival becomes a mental exercise. Luis, the inmate introduced earlier, learned this truth the hard way. The first year he fought the silence. He yelled through the vent, cursed at guards, banged on the walls just to prove he was still there. But anger burns out quickly when no one answers. "You think you're strong," he said, "until silence becomes stronger than you." He began to change. Slowly, deliberately, he built a routine. Waking at 5, reading by the thin strip of daylight that entered through the vent, writing letters he would never send. "When you have nothing," he wrote once, "routine becomes everything." Psychologists call this adaptive isolation. It's how the brain fights against confinement, by creating meaning where there is none. Studies on long-term solitary confinement show patterns of depression, anxiety, and even hallucinations. But they also reveal something remarkable. Human beings have an instinct to survive mentally, even when the body is trapped. The prison's mental health teams visit weekly, offering counseling through the door slot. Sometimes inmates speak, sometimes they just listen. One staff member said, "You learn to measure progress in sentences. If someone says, 'I read a book,' or 'I slept better,' that's a victory." Not everyone adapts. For some, the silence becomes too heavy. The mind starts to fold inward. A few inmates develop paranoia, convinced that every sound is a threat, every shadow a sign. The lack of human contact turns imagination into company, and company into fear. Even the guards are not immune to the psychological weight. Officers walk the same halls, hearing the same sounds, watching the same stillness. Some describe feeling detached, as if the world outside no longer belongs to them either. When you spend 10 hours a day in silence, one correctional officer admitted, you start carrying it home with you. Pelican Bay was built to prevent violence, and in that sense it works. But the cost is invisible. The institution controls the body perfectly, but what happens to the mind is harder to see. Experts say the effects of long-term solitary confinement can mirror post-traumatic stress disorder. Some inmates, when released, struggle to handle open spaces or conversations. Freedom becomes overwhelming. In recent years, reforms have started to reshape how California handles solitary confinement. After lawsuits and public pressure, the state agreed to limit how long inmates can remain in isolation. The prison introduced step-down programs, small privileges like group activities or limited outdoor access, for those who demonstrate good behavior. It's a slow process, but it represents hope, a chance for inmates to prove they can change. Luis entered that program after 12 years in the SHU. He started attending anger management sessions, reading philosophy, and mentoring younger inmates. His letters, once filled with rage, began to sound different. "You don't heal overnight," he wrote. "You heal by facing yourself." Behind the heavy steel doors, the smallest acts of self-control become miracles. Choosing patience instead of anger, reflection instead of blame, these are victories no one outside ever sees. Luis began sending essays to a prison education journal, writing about transformation in the human mind. One of them ended with a line that struck even the guards who read it. "They can take your freedom, but they can't take your chance to change." As the years passed, Luis became known as one of the quiet ones, not because he was broken, but because he had learned peace in the unlikeliest place. He once told a counselor, "You can't undo the past, but you can stop living like you're still in it." The same silence that once tormented him had become his teacher. And in that transformation lies the lesson Pelican Bay never intended to teach. Even in the world's harshest places, redemption can still whisper through the walls. The road out of darkness, in a place built to contain the worst of humanity, it's strange how hope can still find a way in. For Luis, hope didn't arrive like light breaking through the clouds. It came slowly, like a heartbeat returning after years of stillness. He had spent more than a decade inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit, where silence was both punishment and therapy. For years, every sound felt like a reminder of his confinement. But as time passed, those same sounds began to mean something else: stability, order, and a strange kind of peace. Luis was no longer the angry young man who entered the system. The gang tattoos on his arms had faded under the pale prison light, and so had his rage. What replaced it was something unexpected: a quiet strength. He started mentoring younger inmates through the facility's step-down program, helping them adjust to structured rehabilitation. Once a week, he was allowed limited time in a small classroom with other inmates transitioning out of solitary confinement. A correctional counselor led discussions about responsibility, control, and rebuilding identity. At first few spoke. Men who had survived years in silence found it difficult to form sentences again. But over time voices returned. Laughter, soft, cautious, echoed in the concrete room for the first time in years. Luis shared his story with them. "The system will never forget what we did," he told the group, "but we don't have to keep being the people we were." He spent nights writing letters to community organizations outside, letters that told the truth about life inside California's toughest prison. Some of those letters were published in rehabilitation journals and read by college students studying criminal justice. His words began to reach beyond the walls. The staff noticed the change. One senior officer who had watched Luis for years admitted quietly, "You can tell when someone's spirit starts turning the right direction. It's rare here, but it happens." After nearly 15 years in isolation, Luis was approved to move to a lower security unit. The first day he stepped into open sunlight, he froze. The brightness hurt his eyes. He described it later as feeling the sky for the first time. He stood still for minutes, letting the sun warm his face. A guard, watching from a distance, later said he'd never seen anyone so grateful for something so ordinary. For the first time, Luis was able to walk on real soil during outdoor time. The smell of wet grass, the sight of trees beyond the walls, it hit him harder than he expected. "You spend years thinking you're dead inside," he said, "then something like sunlight proves you're still alive." But the real test came when Luis faced the possibility of release. After so many years inside, freedom wasn't simple. He feared the noise, the movement, the choices. He spoke to a prison psychologist about his anxiety. "Freedom," he said, "feels bigger than I remember." That honesty became part of his healing. He began studying restorative justice, learning how victims, communities, and offenders could coexist in forgiveness. He wrote essays about moral responsibility, how acknowledging harm is the first step toward healing it. One of his essays ended with a line that now circulates on motivational websites. "I lost everything chasing respect. I found peace when I learned respect starts with myself." Eventually, Luis earned parole. On the day he left Pelican Bay, the officers didn't shake his hand, but some nodded, a quiet gesture of recognition. He boarded a transport van that took him south toward a reentry program in Los Angeles. From his window, the forests blurred into sunlight. For the first time in decades, there were no walls blocking the view. Today, Luis works with at-risk youth, teaching them what he learned too late, that violence doesn't make you powerful, it makes you disappear. In classrooms and detention centers, he shares the same message over and over: if you think prison is the worst thing that can happen to you, you're wrong. The worst thing is losing who you are before you ever get there. His story has since been featured in educational campaigns about rehabilitation and justice reform across California. Not everyone believes in second chances, but Luis insists that redemption isn't about forgetting the past, it's about refusing to repeat it. Pelican Bay still stands where it always has, silent against the fog. New inmates arrive every month. The cycle continues. But every once in a while, a letter arrives at the prison from the outside, addressed simply to "the man I used to be." It's from Luis. Inside is a poem that ends with a single line that sums up the message he hopes others will hear before it's too late. "I lived in darkness long enough to know light is worth the wait.